The airport terminal pulsed with the restless rhythm of human movement, rolling luggage echoing like a percussion line against polished tile, announcements droning overhead in a metallic voice that somehow blended urgency with monotony, and lines of travelers coiling like restless snakes as they shuffled toward their destinations. Yet in the midst of all this ordinary chaos stood Malcolm Turner, a man who had learned long ago to thrive in storms both visible and unseen, his presence so composed and commanding that even without a word he drew glances from those around him, though most had no clue who he really was, only that his navy suit hung with a tailor's precision, his leather shoes gleamed, and his calm baritone responses to those who brushed past him suggested a man whose authority did not come from appearances alone but from an inner certainty carved by years of struggle, triumph, and discipline. Malcolm was not simply another passenger in line that morning. He was the founder and CEO of Turner Dynamics, a tech conglomerate whose innovations fueled industries from aerospace to defense, a man who had been invited to speak at Davos, whose face had graced Fortune's cover, and yet here, at this gate in a bustling international airport, the carefully woven fabric of his success was about to be tugged by a thread of arrogance and prejudice so seemingly small yet destined to unravel careers in less than an hour, because in this place, where status was often judged by appearances and assumptions rather than truth, Malcolm would once again be reminded that the world still saw him through the distorted lens of bias, but this time the world would pay dearly for its blindness. It began simply enough, with Malcolm approaching the gate for Flight 782 to New York, his ticket already in hand, a first-class seat printed boldly across the top, priority boarding flashing in unmistakable gold letters. Yet when he reached the podium where a young gate attendant stood, her hair pulled into a tight bun and her lips pressed in a thin line of authority she hadn't yet earned, she did not offer him the smile she had offered to the man in a wrinkled gray suit just moments before. Nor the polite nod she had given to the woman in pearls who walked past without even being asked for her ticket. No, when Malcolm approached, she stiffened, her hand rising as though his presence itself was an intrusion, her eyes narrowing with suspicion instead of courtesy, and with a voice rehearsed in false politeness but dripping with something colder beneath, she said, "Sir, this lane is reserved for first-class boarding only." And in that instant, though he remained calm, Malcolm felt the familiar weight of a lifetime of similar moments pressing upon him like invisible luggage, moments when his credentials, his brilliance, his ownership, his hard-earned seat at the table had been doubted or dismissed simply because of the color of his skin. He handed her the ticket anyway, refusing to let the flicker of anger within him disturb the mask of serenity he always wore in public, because Malcolm Turner had not built his empire by shouting in lobbies or throwing tantrums in boardrooms. He had built it by letting his power speak louder than prejudice ever could. Yet even as she took the ticket from him with a smirk, scanning it half-heartedly, the green light of approval flashing instantly across her handheld device, she tilted her head as if considering a lie, and with a shrug she said, "System must be glitching. You'll need to wait until regular boarding, sir," handing back the ticket with a dismissive wave as though that settled the matter, as though his presence here was a mistake she was correcting. Around him, passengers shifted, some glancing at the interaction but quickly looking away, unwilling to interfere, while others clutched their bags tighter, eager not to be delayed by someone else's misfortune, and Malcolm, reading the air as easily as one reads the time on a clock, knew that speaking out in anger would give her and everyone like her exactly the justification they sought, so instead he stepped to the side, calm but not silent inside, his mind already calculating the cost of what had just happened, because what this young attendant did not and could not know was that the man she had so casually dismissed did not just have a first-class ticket. He had majority ownership of the entire airline she represented, his holding company quietly controlling 51% of Aerolux Airlines after a strategic acquisition only 6 months earlier, an acquisition that had deliberately been kept under the radar to avoid market frenzy, meaning that not even most of the staff knew whose empire they were working under. And so the gate attendant had unknowingly insulted not a passenger but her ultimate employer, and the bill for that insult would come due swiftly. For 45 minutes Malcolm stood silently near a pillar, phone in hand, pretending to scroll like any other traveler but in reality drafting a precise, surgical message through the executive portal that only a handful of individuals in the world had access to, his fingers moving with deliberate calm even as passengers continued to board, his silence becoming a storm cloud waiting for release. And as he stood there, he remembered the younger version of himself who had once been denied a job interview because the receptionist assumed he was there to deliver mail, the college days when professors questioned his authorship of brilliant essays, the early years in business when investors asked to speak to the actual CEO, even as he sat at the head of the table, and he thought of how many times he had swallowed pride to play the long game, to rise above insult after insult until there were no more gates to keep him out, only doors he himself owned, and yet even now, standing as one of the most powerful men in the industry, the sting of dismissal still burned, but Malcolm had never been one to let wounds fester. He turned them into weapons, and the weapon today would be swift and merciless justice. When final boarding was called, Malcolm walked forward again, his gait slow, deliberate, the polished floor reflecting his calm authority, and when he extended his ticket once more, the same attendant rolled her eyes, already speaking before he opened his mouth. "Sir, if you continue to disrupt boarding, I'll have security escort you out. This is your last warning," her voice louder now, drawing the attention of those still lingering in line, but before she could finish her threat, Malcolm raised his phone, the glow of the executive login screen illuminating his composed features, and with a single tap he sent the message that would cascade like an earthquake through the corporate structure of Airlines. The attendant's handheld device beeped violently, the screen freezing before flashing access terminated, contact corporate, her smug confidence faltering as she tapped frantically at dead buttons, and in that exact moment two men in dark suits rushed in from the side corridor, their badges marking them as regional supervisors, their faces blanching when they saw who stood at the gate. "Mr. Turner," one of them gasped, nearly tripping over his own words, we weren't aware," but Malcolm's gaze silenced him, that piercing look honed by decades of boardroom battles where words were weapons and silence was the deadliest of all. "I gave your staff 45 minutes to correct a mistake," Malcolm said, his voice steady, quiet enough that passengers had to lean in to hear but sharp enough to cut through the entire terminal, "and instead of correction, I received arrogance, threats, and disrespect. That's not just poor service. That's systemic rot. Effective immediately, this entire crew is terminated. Security will escort them out, replacements will be here before this plane leaves the gate, and you too," he pointed to the supervisors who now looked as if their legs could no longer support them, "will submit resignation letters before midnight. Do I make myself clear?" A gasp rippled through the crowd, phones shot up to record, whispers spread like wildfire, and the gate attendant's face drained of color, her voice breaking as she stammered, You can't just fire us, you're just," but she stopped, her eyes falling on the supervisors who bowed their heads, the reality dawning that the man she had mocked and threatened was not just anything, he was the power she served without knowing it, the hand that fed her paycheck, the name behind the brand stitched on her uniform. Within minutes security officers arrived, ushering the stunned crew away, their protests bouncing off Malcolm's silence as replacement staff in crisp uniforms hurried in, moving with the urgency of people who understood they were stepping into the aftermath of a corporate execution, and as Malcolm finally walked down the jet bridge, the weight of every gaze following him, whispers of, "Who is he?" and, "That's the owner." Chasing after him, he carried himself with the calm satisfaction of a man who had once been forced to endure humiliation but no longer had to, because power meant never asking for respect but commanding it without raising your voice. Settling into his wide leather seat in first class, he removed his tablet, opened documents for an upcoming merger worth billions, and when the captain himself approached, face pale, voice trembling as he said, "Sir, on behalf of Aerolux, I apologize deeply for what happened today," Malcolm glanced up, offered the faintest of smiles, and said, "Apologies don't erase disrespect. Make sure your people remember that," before returning to his work, as if nothing had happened, as if the firing of an entire crew were just another item on his checklist, because for Malcolm Turner, it was another reminder to the world that underestimating him had consequences.